everyone. Here are just some of the places that will go to the polls this year. India, the European Union, Mexico, the United Kingdom, South Africa, South Korea, Taiwan, Belgium, Mongolia, Bhutan, Iceland, and the United States. It's expected this year that more people will head to the polls than any other year in human history, which sounds pretty good for the state of democracy, but how strong is it? Like, how did we get from Fukuyama's vaunted end of history in 1989 to January 6, 2021 in our own backyard? Is the treasured governance of our United States, our Constitution, our bicameral Congress, federalism, our independent judiciary, really serving democracy by preventing populist extremes, as it was designed to do? Or are we, as our authors tonight provocatively suggest, witnessing a creeping tyranny of the minority, which is taking advantage of these institutions to preserve American and political and economic patterns that are now out of date and increasingly inequitable? Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Chat and Chowder. My name is Mary Eintema, and I'm president of World Boston. We're delighted that you're joining us, whether you're in the room or on the Zoom, I should say, with my New England accent. Anyway, I should also note that tonight's Zoom program is being simultaneously translated into Portuguese, thanks to the help of our great community member, Jason Diet. So a special welcome to many folks who are joining us in Brazil tonight. Before we get started, a few reminders. As I hope many of you know, the mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. So thank you for taking part in this mission. Right away, thank you to our hosts at Foley Larder for their kind hospitality. And I want to shout out Natalie Mace, our Director of Global Engagement Programs, who is doing everything to make this event happen, along with other great World Boston colleagues. World Boston staff and board, raise your hands, look around the room, folks, if you have questions, or if you just want to talk, come say hello. And of course, we thank the Lowell Institute, which generously supports Chat and Chowder and Great Decisions, as well as our annual State of the State Department program. The Lowell Institute makes it possible for all of our regular monthly global engagement programs to be free to all attendees, which is wicked cool. But free of charge does not mean free of cost. These programs take a lot of resources. Supporting World Boston at $25 and above will get you this very beautiful pin, there it is, as well as entry into our circle of community supporters. Shout out tonight to new supporters, Jason Diet and Tracy Vickery. You can make a tax-deductible donation to World Boston at any time, or grab one of these very attractive QR codes and make a donation right now. What would you normally spend on a lecture or a bowl of soup? Next, upcoming events. On April 22nd, we look forward to hosting our next Chat and Chowder right here with professors and authors Sidita Kushi and Monica Toft on their book, Dying by the Sword, The Militarization of U.S. Foreign Policy. April 29th, we'll host Great Decisions over at the Boston Public Library on the U.S.-China trade rivalry. We are thrilled to be joined by Wendy Cutler, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. So be sure to register for that program. Also that week, May 2nd, we'll host Chat and Chowder back here with Calder Walton and his book Spies, the epic intelligence war between East and West. You can learn more and register for all of our upcoming programs and donate by using the QR codes on the flyers around the room. Finally, a note on housekeeping. When we turn later to audience Q&A, please raise your hand so that you can ask a question which ends with a question mark, and someone will bring a microphone to you. We will try and take a few questions from Zoom. Please submit your Zoom question to the Q&A box, and our staff will try to read out a couple of Zoom questions. Now, at long last, tonight's program, we're thrilled to be joined by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. For the sake of time, I'll abbreviate their very impressive biographies, but you can find them in full on our website. Stephen Levitsky is David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and a Professor of Government at Harvard University. He's also Director of Harvard's David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions, with a focus on Latin America. Daniel Ziblatt is the Eaton Professor of Government at Harvard University, where he's also the director of Harvard's Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies. He also leads a research group at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. His research focuses on European politics and the comparative study of democracy. In 2023, Daniel Ziblatt was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Wow. Prior to co-authoring Tyranny of the Minority, as many of you know, our speakers tonight also co-wrote How Democracies Die, New York Times bestseller list that has been translated into 25 languages. So I think they've got a good thing going as a team. Anyway, Professor Levitsky, Professor Ziblatt, thank you very much for joining us tonight. With that, I turn it over to you.
That's a really impressive lineup of speakers you've got. I worry this week may be a sort of, but at least you know the chowder was good. So the United States is experiencing what political scientists call democratic backsliding. All leading global democracy indexes register a decline for the United States since 2016. Just take one example. Freedom House has a global freedom index that scores every country every year from a low of 0, I think North Korea, to a high of 100. I think 3 countries get a score of 100. A decade ago, 2015, 14, 15, the U.S. got a score of 92 out of 100. Pretty good. Put us on par with Canada, Japan, UK, Germany. Today, the U.S. score is 83. Which is still above the line for democracy, but is tied with Romania and below Argentina. That may seem shocking to you, but when you have widespread efforts to restrict voting, violent threats against election workers, elected officials, and prosecutors, and an attempt by an incumbent president to overturn an election, you fall to the point where Freedom House considers you less democratic than Argentina, because that doesn't happen in Argentina. Now, democracies, as you all know, do not die like they used to die. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns, army leaders like Franco and Pinochet. Today, they're much more likely to die at the hands of elected leaders themselves, elected presidents and prime ministers who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. Excuse me. This is Putin, it's Chavez, it's Orban, it's Erdogan, it's Modi. If democracy dies in the United States, this is how it's going to happen. It'll happen gradually, almost imperceptibly, and seemingly, at least in the eyes of many, legally. We talk a little bit about this. Elected autocrats follow a pretty familiar playbook at this point. Almost invariably, they begin by capturing what we call the referees. I'm a sports fan, so I'm going to use a sports metaphor. By referees, we mean government agencies responsible for investigating and punishing wrongdoing. The Justice Department, law enforcement agencies, courts, election authorities, tax authorities. Putin, Chavez, Orban, Erdogan, Modi, all of them began by removing professional civil servants who running these agencies and replacing them with loyalists. Once you control the referees, once you control investigative, tax, law enforcement agencies, you can use them as weapons against your rival. You can use the Justice Department and the FBI to investigate and to prosecute critics, often by digging up petty infractions and prosecuting for it. You can use tax investigations to target business leaders who finance opposition groups or independent media. You can harass editors and journalists with libel and defamation suits. If you control the courts, you can actually jail critics or force them to flee the country. But importantly, even if you don't control the courts, simply launching a barrage of investigations, and prosecutions can have a really powerful effect on the opposition. It can bankrupt them. It can ruin their reputations. It can intimidate them into silence, or it may just exhaust them into giving up. And once it becomes clear that any prominent government critic risks having their lives, sort of every aspect of their life investigated, risks being dragged into really costly legal battles, risks facing an endless barrage of online threats and harassment, once it becomes clear that that's the cost, the price that you pay for opposition, not jail, but just this harassment, most citizens end up deciding to stay on the sidelines. Journalists decide not to write about politics. Business people decide to keep their heads down and to avoid controversy. And young people, talented young people, decide to just steer clear out of politics because it's too risky. The result is a depleted and exhausted opposition, a silent and cowering private sector, and a media that's effectively bullied into self-censorship. This is what we see over time in Russia, Venezuela, Hungary, Turkey. Now, there's one more element to this authoritarian cocktail that I want to highlight because it's, I think, not attended to enough and very important, and that is violence. Democratic breakdown is very often, almost always preceded by a rise in political violence. Think of Italy in the 20s, Germany and Spain in the 30s, South America in the 1970s. I want to suggest, or I want to remind you, that the specter of that kind of violence is already present here. There were violent threats against hundreds of election workers and election officials in 2020, against judges and prosecutors in Trump's court cases, against elected officials who speak out against Trump. Republican lawmakers who voted for Trump's impeachment received a barrage of death threats. According to Mitt Romney, according to Liz Cheney, according to several other retired Republican lawmakers, many Republican lawmakers in the Senate in particular voted against Trump's impeachment and conviction because they feared physical harm to themselves or their families. Think about that. Trump may well have been acquitted because senators feared what would happen to them physically if they voted to convict. This is what's coming if Trump wins. I say this because Trump has said as much. Trump has been very clear about what he will do if he returns to the White House. He has told us that he'll pardon the January 6th insurrectionists and others who tried to violently overturn the election. He has told us that he will purge the public administration of civil servants and pack it with loyalists. He has told us that he will use the Justice Department to investigate and prosecute rivals. He's told us that he will go after independent media. He's told us that he will support vigilante justice against immigrants and suspected criminals. He's told us that he'll use the army under the Insurrection Act to repress protests. Our book, Tyranny of the Minority, tries to explain why our democracy relatively suddenly is under threat. And we argue most broadly that America is undergoing an unprecedented transition, a transition to a multiracial democracy in which a majority ethnic group loses its dominant status. No democracy anywhere has fully undergone such a transition. And that transformation has triggered an authoritarian reaction among a minority of Americans. That, though, is only part of the story, at least in the book. Our Constitution, we argue, is exacerbating the problem by empowering that authoritarian minority. I want to talk for a few minutes about the Republican Party's recent turn away from democracy, and then Daniel will take up the critical questions of why this is happening and what we can do about it. He'll solve everything. I'm just going to lay out the problem. All right, basic point. Democracy cannot survive for very long if one of the major political parties is not committed to playing by democratic rules. That's pretty basic. Political parties that are committed to democracy, what the great political scientist Juan Linz called loyal Democrats, parties that are committed to democracy must do three things. They must always unambiguously accept the results of elections, win or lose, pretty basic. They must unambiguously reject political violence, and they must break completely with violent or anti-democratic forces. They must have nothing to do with violent or anti-democratic forces. First two are pretty obvious. I want to spend a minute on this third point of breaking with anti-democratic forces. Individual leaders cannot kill a democracy on their own. They need accomplices. They need accomplices almost inevitably among mainstream politicians. These mainstream politicians who turn out to be accomplices are what the political science pundits called semi-loyal Democrats. Not loyal Democrats, but semi-loyal Democrats. Semi-loyalist Democrats can be hard to identify in a crowd. They look, they dress, they talk like ordinary politicians. They're not actually out there trying to kill democracy. They're just trying to get ahead in politics, right? They're trying to win the speakership, the House speakership, or become the Senate majority leader, or maybe just fend off a primary challenge. But semi-loyalists are critical enablers of authoritarianism. And the key tell to identify a semi-loyalist is how they respond to authoritarian threats from their own camp that emerge from within, on their own side. When anti-democratic forces emerge on their own flank, committed Democrats, loyal Democrats, do three things. First of all, they publicly condemn anti-democratic behavior, even if it's done by their own side. They expel anti-democratic extremists from their ranks. They refuse to nominate them. They refuse to appoint them to public office. They refuse to support their candidacies. And crucially, loyal Democrats join forces, are willing to join forces with pro-democratic rivals from across the ideological spectrum, from across the political aisle, in order to isolate and defeat the extremists. They will align with people they disagree with in order to defend democracy. This is Liz Cheney. Semi-loyal Democrats do none of these things. Rather than repudiate anti-democratic behavior in their own camp, they downplay it, they justify it, or in many cases, they just hide under the table and remain silent. They didn't see the tweet. And rather than expelling anti-democratic extremists, semi-loyalists will tolerate them, will accommodate them, and sometimes even support them. This is crucial. When mainstream political parties or when mainstream politicians tolerate or condone or justify anti-democratic extremists, it normalizes them. So media start to treat them like ordinary politicians. Donors who once shunned the extremists now decide it's okay to fund their campaigns. Leading consultants and pollsters start to return their phone calls. And of course, crucially, voters start to take them more seriously. A crystal clear lesson from democratic breakdowns in Europe in the 1930s and South America in the 1960s and 70s is that when mainstream political parties of the center left or the center right start to tolerate, start to flirt with violent extremists, democracies get into trouble. I want to suggest that since 2020, the Republican Party has violated all three of these basic principles of democratic behavior. Not only was Donald Trump the first U.S. president in the history of the Republic to refuse to accept the results of an election, but crucially, the bulk of the Republican Party went along with it. The Republican, a Never Trump organization called the Republican Accountability Project, evaluated the public statements of all 261 Republican members of Congress, House and Senate, in the weeks following the 2020 election, to evaluate whether they cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2020 election. 86% of them cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2020 election. Accepting the results of an election is the cardinal rule of democracy. Democracy cannot survive without it. 86% of Republican lawmakers violated that rule. Republican politicians have also begun to flirt with political violence. In his stump speech now, over and over again, Trump now openly embraces the January 6th insurrectionists as heroes and as great patriots. During the 2022 congressional campaign, the New York Times found that more than 100 Republican candidates brandished or fired semi-automatic weapons in their commercials. I can think, Daniel may have a different recollection, I can think of no other major party in any established democracy in which candidates so openly embraced violence. But the biggest problem, the biggest threat posed by the contemporary Republican Party is the party's refusal to break with openly anti-democratic forces. Semi-loyalty is now pervasive in the Republican Party. Republican leaders, almost to a person, knew that Trump lost the 2020 election. Many of them were privately troubled by his anti-democratic behavior, but they enabled it anyway. They protected Trump by refusing to impeach and convict him. They blocked creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th. I'm going to finish my part. And crucially, so let me say that again. They protected Trump by refusing to impeach and convict him. They blocked creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection. And crucially, almost all of them will back Trump in the 2024 election, even if he's convicted of trying to overturn an election. Important point. It does not have to be this way. Look at Brazil. Brazil's Trump-like president, Jair Bolsonaro, lost his re-election bid in 2022 and tried to overturn the results just like Trump. But his allies refused to go along with it. All of Brazil's leading right-wing politicians recognized Bolsonaro's defeat on election night. The president of Congress, leading senators, leading governors. Brazil had a January 6th-like event on January 8th, 2023. Protesters stormed not only the Congress, but the presidency and the Supreme Court building. Conservative politicians forcefully condemned the insurrection and pushed for a congressional investigation into it. Nobody downplayed it. Nobody condoned it. No one defended it. Nobody called the rioters heroes or patriots. And finally, whereas the Republicans will nominate Trump unanimously this year despite his coup attempt, in Brazil the courts have barred Bolsonaro from participating in elections for 8 years, and relatively few politicians have rallied to his defense. So whereas Trump remains a serious contender for the U.S. presidency, Bolsonaro has been pushed to the political sidelines and may well be headed to prison. That's how democracy is defended. So there was another path. Republicans just chose not to pursue it. Now, before I turn over the mic to Daniel, let me be clear. Not all Republicans are authoritarian. There are many small d Democrats among the Republicans. But the refusal to unambiguously accept the results of elections, the growing flirtation with violence, and crucially, the near unanimous embrace of a leader who tried to overturn an election is pretty clear evidence of a party that's no longer committed to democracy. I'm done. Sorry to go over.
All right. So, great. Thank you. Yeah. So, so I just want to reiterate something that Steve just said. I mean, these criteria that we just described of accepting elections, win or lose, not using violence to gain or hold on to power, and distancing yourself from other politicians who engage in that kind of behavior, these are criteria to describe the behavior of political leaders. Voters can vote for whoever they want, right? I mean, the issue is here, what Steve is making the case is there's been this remarkable transformation in the leadership of the Republican Party. And it's really rare to see this kind of thing happen. It's really unusual when we look at the history of democracy, we both study the history of democracies, to see a political party that's basically been committed to democracy, playing by democratic rules for over a century, to suddenly abandon that. Very rare in world history. Now, we have certainly seen the rise of radical right parties that share certain features with the Republican Party within Western Europe. Anti-immigrant radical right parties, some parties that seem to be rejecting democracy. We see this everywhere, but nowhere among the established mainstream parties, the kind of partner parties or sort of sister parties of the Republican Party in Western Europe, let's say the British Tory Party or the German CDU, these mainstream parties have not abandoned democracy. So what has driven this? Well, so in our book, we highlight two factors, as Steve said. First is the role of status loss and the perception of an existential threat as America has become an increasingly multiracial democracy. Political parties are more likely to accept defeat when the electoral stakes are relatively low, when parties and their constituents are confident that losing is not going to bring ruinous consequences. Parties are more likely to turn against democracy when they think that defeat will bring existential threat or ruinous consequences. So in other words, it's a kind of outsized fear of losing that leads parties to turn against democracy. And we really believe that this is partly, in a significant way, fueling the radicalization of the Republican Party. The U.S. is undergoing a transition that no other democracy has ever undergone. That is one in which a long dominant ethnic majority loses not only its numerical majority, but its dominant social status in society. So this perception that's certainly exacerbated by demagogues that exists among many MAGA voters that the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. That's a powerful perception of existential threat, powerful enough to turn a party away from democracy. So that's one big factor. We describe this in more detail in the book, this kind of sense of status threat in the midst of a major demographic transformation as America makes this transition. But in our book, we also highlight a second factor, a second big factor, connected with America's political institutions. And in particular, we focus on the U.S. Constitution. So think of it this way. The radicalization of an authoritarian minority within a democracy, a minority faction, in effect, in the U.S. would pose much less of a threat if the U.S. were like other democracies in which majorities routinely govern. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. Steve and I study democracies all around the world, and we can tell you actually that the rise of radical right parties is not so unusual. There's around 30% of voters in most West European democracies that support radical right parties. The Alternative for Germany in Germany, the party that just did very successfully in the Netherlands in November, in Italy, in France, everywhere across Western Europe, you have around 30% of the electorate that's attracted to these kinds of political parties. The number's sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but the same also applies in the United States. The core of the MAGA faction within the United States is about 30% of the U.S. voting base. So the point here is that America's voters are actually not so different from those who live in West European democracies. Yet only in America have we experienced the kind of democratic backsliding that Steve began our talk with tonight. So what makes the U.S. distinctive is not its voters, it's something else. It's our political institutions. Again, it's our Constitution. Now, our Constitution, to be sure, is a remarkable document. It served us very well. It's a brilliant document. It deserves to be defended. But it's also a document that protects political minorities. And when that minority is authoritarian, this can be extremely dangerous. Our Constitution was written in a pre-democratic era, so it contains within it, and continues to contain within it, certain undemocratic features that empower political minorities in a way that no other democracy does. Now, it's certainly true that liberal democracy requires constraints on majorities. That's why we have an independent judiciary. This is why we have a Bill of Rights. But the U.S. Constitution, this pre-democratic, very old Constitution, contains an excessive number of these kinds of constraints on majorities, what we call counter-majoritarian institutions. You're actually all very familiar with these. The Electoral College allows the loser of the popular vote to win office, something that, of course, has happened twice in the 21st century. Our second chamber, the U.S. Senate, with equal representation for each state, allows a political party to hold power without necessarily winning majorities, popular majorities. Our federal judiciary, without term limits or retirement age, allows judges appointed in one generation to thwart the majorities of generations later. Now, these three core pillars of our national political institutions make it very difficult for majorities to govern. And then when you add to that something that's not in our Constitution, the filibuster, the rule within the U.S. Senate that requires supermajorities to pass everyday normal legislation, you add all of this up, and the U.S. is a complete outlier, a constitutional outlier. Now, what's interesting is that this kind of counter-majoritarianism used to not be so unusual. If you go back to the 19th century, the 18th century in Europe, this was very common to have these kinds of constraints on majorities. But over the course of the 19th and especially the 20th century, most other democracies, all other democracies, have dropped these kinds of institutions. By weakening upper chambers, think of the House of Lords in Britain, over the course of the 20th century, essentially became irrelevant. Other democracies got rid of their upper chambers altogether, these aristocratic upper chambers. Other democracies got rid of kind of filibuster-like rules to make it easy so that you could have a majority pass a law in a parliament. All other democracies imposed retirement ages or term limits on Supreme Court justices. And every other democracy, presidential democracy on earth, got rid of its electoral college for selecting a president. Argentina was the last democracy in 1994. So as other democracies have become more democratic over the last century, the U.S. has not. These institutions that I've just described in the US are dangerous because they empower an authoritarian minority. And what they do is they give an artificial boost to these kinds of parties, and it makes our politics often look like a dead heat, when often actually it's not. In some ways it's an institutionally, in part at least, an institutionally manufactured dead heat. So think about the presidency. Democrats have won the popular vote for the presidency 7 out of the 8 last presidential elections. Republicans have only won once since 1988. But Republicans have held the presidency for nearly half this time. Something very similar is true in the US Senate. The Democrats have won the overall popular vote in every 6-year cycle in the Senate since 2000, and Republicans have controlled the Senate for half the time. And then finally, the Supreme Court. 3 of our current 9 Supreme Court justices were nominated by a president who lost the popular vote and confirmed by a Senate that didn't represent a majority. So this is having an effect on our democracy, in which it increasingly feels like to many citizens that we're operating in a system of minority rule. And what this means is that policy preferences, what people want, are really out of sync with the kind of policies that we actually have. So as we show in our book, overwhelming majorities of Americans support more robust gun control. Overwhelming majorities of Americans support more robust efforts to deal with poverty and income inequality. Majorities of Americans support abortion rights of the sort guaranteed by Roe versus Wade. Now, this disjuncture between what voters want and what our public policies has many sources, but certainly our institutions that thwart majorities are part of the problem. So that's one effect. A second effect is that this is having an effect on the Republican Party itself. Counter-majoritarian institutions, these institutions which favor minorities, shield the Republican Party at the national level from competitive pressure. If you think about democratic competition, it's supposed to work like a marketplace. When a firm can't sell products, it has to fire the manager, come up with a new strategy. In a democracy, something similar is supposed to be in operation. Political parties that can't win voters, that keeps losing elections, supposed to come up with a new strategy, new faces, and try to reach a broader new segment of the electorate. Well, that's not really happening today with the Republican Party. If you think back to the Democratic Party in the 1980s, lost a series of presidential elections in a row. By 1992, you get a new Democrat in the face of Bill Clinton. This process of adaptation isn't happening in the Republican Party. Repeated underperformance has not led to a major effort to rethink strategy. And again, I think what we try to make the case here is that this is because our institutions, in a sense, provide the Republicans an institutional crutch. Republicans don't actually have to win national majorities to win the presidency. They can win the presidency with 47% of the vote. So extremism doesn't cost them as it would in a truly competitive environment. If Republicans had to win national majorities, popular majorities, to wield power, they'd have to rein in their extremism. So in this way, our institutions are contributing to the problem. So I'll conclude here just looking ahead to 2024, this coming election this fall, as you began with the opening. The elections are important elections, obviously, coming up. We face 2 challenges as I think about this, and as we kind of think about the implications of our book. One a short-term challenge, one a long-term challenge. When facing a democratic threat, the lesson from other countries is very, very clear, which is that it's critical to put together a big, broad, pro-democracy coalition, even if that at times is very uncomfortable. So in the US for this year, the challenge is how to bring together all pro-democratic forces, ranging from figures like Liz Cheney to AOC. They should be sitting next to each other the next time Joe Biden talks about threats to our democracy. We need a coalition that includes progressives, labor, civil rights groups, and conservative business leaders, religious leaders, all committed to democracy. Now, of course, this kind of coalition is fragile, it's vulnerable to fracture. Debates over immigration can do this. And as we've seen in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, debates over foreign policy can fracture this kind of coalition. But it's really critical. It's important because these pro-democratic coalitions are essential. And when they split, that's when democracy gets into trouble. So the way Viktor Orban returned to power back in 2010 in Hungary was a fractured opposition. The way the authoritarian Law and Justice Party in Poland was ejected from power last year was the broad coalition, people who really didn't like each other that much, but who were all committed to democracy, defeated this party at the ballot box. So in the United States, we similarly need to isolate anti-democratic and semi-loyal forces, as Steve talked about, and they need to be defeated in elections. That's the short run. But we also need to step back and ask the longer run question, why does each national election feel like a national emergency? We can get through 2024, but we'll continue to face this challenge unless we address the underlying ills of our system. And to deal with this longer term threat, Steve and I make the case in our book that we need to return in the United States to an agenda of democratizing our democracy. In the US, there's a long tradition of making our Constitution more democratic. After the Civil War, this was the case. In the early 20th century, the Progressive era, when this institution you were just describing was founded right in this same period, the early 20th century. Also in the 1960s. So we have to take up this mantle again and unleash the competitive forces of democracy. So in our book, we propose 15 long-run agenda items for democratic reform. I won't go through all of them, just very briefly mention a few. Entrench voting rights, ensuring equal access to the ballot, replace the Electoral College with direct presidential elections, democratize the Senate by weakening the filibuster, establish term limits for Supreme Court justices. The common thread through all of these is it needs to be made easier for majorities to actually govern in the United States. This may sound unrealistic to some of you in immediate term, and that's right. None of this is going to happen before the elections in 2024. But it's not as unrealistic as it sounds for two reasons. First of all, these reforms that we propose are things that every other democracy in the world has adopted. Second, the way that this reform has happened in the past in the United States and elsewhere is people have begun to talk about it. The quickest way to assure that our system never changes is to refuse to ever talk about it seriously in the first place. So we need to keep these items on the public agenda. But again, none of this will happen before 2024, and the most pressing challenge today is how to keep together a big pro-democracy coalition and to remember that all other issues, tax cuts, immigration policy, foreign policy, all of these are secondary because our democracy is at stake. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both very much. We're going to have some questions. I'm using my phone, not because I'm checking my dinner order, but just to stay in touch with my colleagues. Anyway, all right, so hands up and we'll see how we can do. So we'll start over here.
Hi, thank you. This was a really, really interesting talk and really exciting to engage with your ideas. I myself am a political scientist in training, so really excited to sort of engage with these ideas as well. I just wanted to ask two really quick questions. One was on this idea of semi-loyalty, really fascinating concept, and sort of trying to figure how this works in terms of, say, when political cleavages sort of force a type of politics of sort of ethnic cleavages. I know, question with a question mark. How do you sort of see that in the sense when people sort of go to the point of moving with these cleavages, but stop short of sort of a liberal democratic social contract? The first question. The second question is this idea of democratic backsliding. Of course, some political scientists are sort of in debate as to whether or not that actually is a thing. I want to sort of understand how you guys see this idea of democratic backsliding. How would you sort of interpret that debate as well? Thank you.
All right. So the way I understand, so historically, we political scientists have thought about democratic breakdown, and in the good old days, that's how democracies died. There was in most cases, a pretty rapid rupture of the democratic process. You could tell in Nazi Germany, in Pinochet's Chile, in Franco's Spain, that democracy had broken down. That happens occasionally in the world today, but it's much more likely to be a much more gradual, difficult to gauge. So I think I understand democratic backsliding to mean a process of sort of retrogression within the realm of democracy. So backsliding can lead to eventual breakdown, as occurred in, say, Venezuela. In other cases, a country like the United States, or probably this is what happened in Poland, I would say even Hungary, become less democratic, but the regime is still sort of identifiably intact. So it's a somewhat fuzzy term, but it captures the way in which democracies weaken today in contrast to the way they died in the 20th century.
I mean, the way I understood the question is, this concept of semi-loyalty is having people rally to the defense of democracy when there are kind of deep commitments dividing people. I mean, so at some level, it's requiring, it's how, I mean, in a way, your question is like, how realistic is it to say that people are going to stand up for democracy when their allegiances lie with the other side for all sorts of other reasons? And so, if that is your question, you're nodding, so being polite, but I mean, it's a good point. I mean, the interesting thing, though, is that when democracies have survived, there have been moments where people who might look like semi-loyalists rally behind democracy. We tell the story in the book. We tell lots of good stories. One story we tell is in Spain in 1981. There was right after the Spanish transition to democracy, there was an attack on the Spanish parliament. Kind of familiar thing. These was led by soldiers, though. They were in control of the parliament for about 24 hours or overnight. And eventually they kind of were forced out. And the next day, or within several days, politicians from across the political spectrum, from socialists and communists to post-Francoists, so people who are fascist, post-fascist in effect, who previously had supported the authoritarian government, marched arm in arm with thousands of people through the streets, hundreds of thousands of people through the streets of Madrid. So they stood up for democracy. Democracy in Spain has been stable ever since. So when the stakes are clear, I think people are willing to overlook their kind of narrow interests. I think people get into problems of semi-loyalty because they're acting recklessly. They don't think their decisions matter that much. I think that's really it's a miscalculation at a certain level and kind of looking out for your own narrow interests. And so it's less driven, I think, by these deeper cleavages.
Okay, we're going to get a question from Zoom.
So question from Zoom from Martin von Tersch. How would expanding House of Representatives membership, item 12 of your proposed reforms, mitigate some of the other issues you've identified for reform?
So we do make the case for expanding the House of Representatives. This is something that was done throughout American history until the 1920s, after each census, especially as states were added. But even as populations grew, the idea was that congressional districts, as the population grows and you hold this number of members in the House of Representatives constant, what this means is that congressional districts keep getting bigger and bigger. And so, like, who here has actually had a conversation with your House member? That's really not a couple of you well connected, right? I mean, it's not something that everybody does, but part of the problem is that our congressional districts have gotten bigger because we haven't expanded the House of Representatives since the 1920s. So just on that grounds alone, it's sort of a good thing to think about doing once again. But that has this other effect that it allows areas that have more population to have more representation, which then in turn also has the effect, if you remember how the Electoral College balance is calculated in each state, it's the 2 senators of each state plus the House delegation. So more populous states would have more representation, and it would make the selection of the presidency in that way more representative.
Okay, so we'll do Mary.
Wow, so many questions.
A question.
Yeah. A question. Would making or having elections on weekends bring out more people to vote? Because nowadays we have the election on a Tuesday. So you have working people who go, I don't have time to go vote because it takes too long.
Yeah, really quickly, in the U.S. is a real outlier in this sense. In most democracies, voting is pretty core to any democracy, right? So in most democracies in the world, in Latin America, in Europe, elsewhere, governments work hard to make it easy for people to vote because voting is what you're supposed to do in a democracy. The U.S., unfortunately, has a very long history and a very long tradition of governments and politicians working to make it harder for people to vote. The U.S. is almost unique in that sense. But in the book, we advocate for a set of reforms to make it easier to vote. It ought to be easy to vote. So one of them is automatic registration. This is common in most democracies in the world. You turn 18, you're automatically registered to vote. And another one is to make Election Day either on a Sunday, like in most democracies, or a national holiday. It should not be difficult, costly for citizens to vote. Totally agree.
Okay, so we're going to do sort of a lightning round here. We'll do Debbie and David. Sorry, yeah, okay.
Well, thank you. This has been so thought-provoking and stimulating and scary. So I'm wondering, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, given that there's so many restrictions already vis-a-vis the tyranny that are mitigating what you're proposing, what do you think the outcome is going to be in 24 and shortly thereafter?
Great, thanks.
I'll let him answer that one.
Okay.
It's my turn. Yeah, I don't, I don't know. I do think that the thing that gives me some hope is that overwhelming majorities of Americans are committed to democracy, and don't sort of want to stand for the nonsense that we often see, right? So the issue is, I think the big issue is whether or not that broad coalition of people can stick together. I mean, that's the lesson of, and what that means in the context of the United States today is either people not turning out to vote because they think, they're not, angry at the Democratic Party for one reason or another, or voting for third-party candidates. I think this is the way that this kind of broad coalition could fracture in the United States. But, if you really were to, at the end of the day, I think if people turn out to vote and this coalition sticks together, then I think that leaves me optimistic.
Okay.
I just want to make a comment about this book. It's one, I read it this morning.
With a question mark.
Wonderful book. And the question is, in the introduction, it said your previous book had been translated into 23 languages. Is this book going to be translated? Because it's not only about America, you have great information about 20, 30 different countries.
You get an easy question.
It's probably not going to make it to 29 different languages, but it is being published in Spanish, in Portuguese, in German, maybe a handful of others. Not quite as widespread. This is more about the United States than the first book was, so it's not going to diffuse quite as widely. But we are publishing it abroad.
Okay. Do we have one on Zoom?
All right, we have a Zoom question from Ifizielo Coelho. Do you see a relationship between these movements to undermine democracies and new geopolitical tensions? Leaders with superpowers can foment new conflicts and international disagreements more easily than democratic leaders, considering they have fewer restrictions to their actions. Should we be worried?
Yeah. So I took the question to be about whether or not geopolitics affects American democracy and whether authoritarian leaders in other countries exert influence on democracy. And that's certainly the case. I mean, one of the things that's happened over the last 20 years is there was a period in which in the late 1990s when democracy was really regarded as the thing that everybody was striving after. And as Russia turned away from any effort to even try to establish a democracy and China became a kind of model, there's all these alternative models out there, and there's increasingly a kind of network of forces that are not committed to democracy. So the fact that Viktor Orban is kind of lauded by many Republicans as a model, that Hungary should be a model. I mean, Hungary's Freedom House score, Steve mentioned the beginning that the U.S. used to have a score of 92. It's now a score of 83. I think Hungary's is like 66. So, this is not really a model unless you don't want a democracy. But I think the international dynamics really do matter. I mean, the lessons from the 1920s and 1930s, similarly, there's a kind of international dynamic to this, and people there's models out there. There's a kind of authoritarian playbook that Steve described. And this is something that certainly makes democracy more vulnerable.
Did you want to add to that? Or?
Sure. This is a timeless democracy. We can never sleep completely easily in defense of democracy. Citizens always must be vigilant. And in every generation in history, there has emerged an alternative to democracy that's like a shining object. Democracies are messy. Democracies are slow. Democracies are incremental. People get bored and tired and frustrated with their democratic governments. And so every generation you will find, whether it's Stalinist Russia or fascist Italy or Nazi Germany or Castro's Cuba or Hungary today or China today, you will find many people pointing to this alternative model that claims to work better. But there's a lot of data, a lot of evidence over time, over history, that this is just false. At the end of the day, democracies not only are the only system that allow us to criticize our governments and not pay a price for it, the only system that allows us to peacefully and regularly change governments we don't like, but democracies actually perform at least as well, if not better, economically in areas like corruption and crime than authoritarian regimes.
Okay, wow. All right, I know there's a million more questions, but I think there's also a lot of discussions to be had in this room. So we're going to move to our next portion, which is buying books over in the corner there and networking and mingling, but not before we thank our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.